Today, as I discussed in my previous video, the most important event over the past 24 hours is the Turkish presidential election. I said that it would be an remarkable electoral upset if, after his strong showing in the first round of the presidential election some weeks ago, President Erdogan failed to gain re-election. Well, in the event that upset has not happened, and he has in fact been re-elected. Now, I'm taking these results from Daily Sabah, a Turkish newspaper. It has an English language website. Judging from the articles that appear in Daily Sabah, it is a strongly pro-Erdogan newspaper, as I believe most of the Turkish media nowadays is. But anyway, they are saying that with 99.85% of the votes counted, President Erdogan has won 52.16% of the vote, as opposed to his opponent, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. I apologize to Turkish viewers for my appalling mispronunciation of Turkish names. But anyway, Erdogan's opponent, according to Daily Sabah, won 47.84% of the vote. So a clear, though hardly an overwhelming victory by Erdogan. Now, interestingly, turnout, again, I'm taking these figures from Daily Sabah. Turnout is 84.22%. Now, that is very high turnout indeed by international standards. And there were two other rather curious aspects to this election, which I think I would mention. The first is that Erdogan apparently won 58% of overseas votes. Those are votes of Turkish people who live abroad. Now, in my experience, following elections where the result is disputed, it is particularly difficult to control the votes of people who vote in an election from abroad. So the fact that Erdogan appears to have won 58% of those votes, that rather suggests that this election was indeed clean. It is, after all, strongly in line with the final figures. And he also appears to have won, Erdogan also appears to have won, interestingly, in the areas that were most affected by the earthquake, the recent earthquake, where I, for one, thought that he might lose support, have lost support, because firstly of criticism, some of which I suspect is justified, about the poor construction standards of many of the buildings in the area, which Erdogan, as Turkey's leader now for, well, over 20 years, could be said to be responsible for. There's some claims, by the way, that he was more heavily involved in the construction industry even than that members of his family have been very heavily involved in the construction industry. Anyway, I did think that some of that might have a bad impact on him, and there was a bad electoral impact on him. And there were also criticisms that of the speed with which the Turkish authorities, or rather the lack of speed with which the Turkish authorities responded to the earthquake. But in spite of all of that, according to official figures at least, Erdogan has won a majority of votes in the earthquake zone. So, as I said, a clear, decisive, though not overwhelming victory. And that, of course, happening against the background of a severe financial crisis, economic crisis in Turkey for many years now, for several years now. Erdogan has shown a consistent unwillingness to raise living standards, to raise interest rates, interest rates. His unwillingness to raise interest rates has often put pressure on the Turkish currency, the lira. It has caused the currency to fall. It has caused inflation to rise. There have been times when inflation has been running in triple figures, putting heavy pressure on the living standards of people in Turkey. And so there's been a difficult economic legacy. There's been the problems with the war in Syria. Erdogan supported the overthrow of President Assad. He opened the frontier, the border, to anti-Assad insurgent groups. It also meant, by the way, that millions of refugees from Syria and perhaps other places in the Middle East flooded into Turkey across that largely open border. He sent eventually Turkish troops into Syria, something which his military had initially opposed. Those troops in turn suffered losses in Turkey. And anyway, the whole adventure, the whole Syrian adventure, as even Erdogan himself seems to realize, has gone horribly wrong, and Turkish opinion turned against it. Nonetheless, notwithstanding this complex record, it must be said that there's been significant achievements as well in Erdogan's long period of rule. Anybody who is familiar with Turkey will be aware of the material transformation that has taken place in Turkey over the last 20 years, and that is putting to one side the very important cultural and religious policies that he has followed, which are also supported by many people in Turkey. But nonetheless, overall, a complicated legacy, one which ought to have, and perhaps might have had, a negative impact on his chances of success in this election. It's also the case that he's notably greyer, slower. He's looking tired on occasion. He had a bout of illness during the election, with some reports probably wrongly, in fact almost certainly wrongly, claiming that he'd even suffered some kind of a heart attack. Well, he looks older, more tired, and yet, notwithstanding all of that, a critical mass of people in Turkey, a majority of those who voted, decided nonetheless in the second round to vote for him. And why did they do that? Well, I think the short answer is because of the pressure from the West. This is a difficult thing, I think, for many people in the West to understand. But in the weeks leading up to the election, especially the first round of the election, Western governments, or at least if not the governments, Western media, undoubtedly reflecting the opinions of many of the West's governments, made it fairly obvious that they wanted to see Erdogan go. Erdogan has refused to impose sanctions on Russia. He has pursued what he calls an even-handed policy, a neutral policy, in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. In practice, that has meant forging ever closer economic ties with Russia. He's built nuclear power stations. He's arranged for the Russians to build big nuclear power stations in Russia. He's worked with Russia to convert Turkey into a gas hub with Turk Stream pipeline constructed. Turkish construction companies are busy in Russia. Russian tourists come to Turkey. I believe it's the most important destination for Russian tourists in the Mediterranean and perhaps the world. They come to Turkey despite attempts by the Western powers to prevent these tourists using the Mir card in Turkey, despite the reluctance of some Turkish banks to accept the Mir card. It seems that arrangements have been made in Turkey to make it possible for Russian tourists to draw money using the Mir card in Turkey. And, of course, and most importantly, in terms of the conflict that's happened between Russia and Ukraine right at the outset of this conflict back in February 2022. Erdogan's government closed the straits. They closed the Dardanelles to warships, both of the combatant powers, Ukraine and Russia. Ukrainian and Russian warships can exit the Black Sea via the Dardanelles, but they can't enter the Black Sea via the Dardanelles. And of course, he's also stopped NATO countries, other countries, from deploying their warships in the Black Sea as well. So the Black Sea has in effect been shut off to the navies of the West. From the Russian perspective, this has been an extremely helpful move. The Russians can reinforce their navy in the Black Sea, as I've discussed many times. They have the capacity to send many of their small missile boats, and most of the Russian navy in the Black Sea, by the way, the surface component of the Russian navy in the Black Sea consists of small missile boats. They can travel to the Black Sea from the places where they're kept in reserve, like the Caspian Sea, deep within the Eurasian landmass, out of reach of Ukraine. They can be sent up the rivers. They can be sent from manufacturing, Russian shipyards, in places like Nizhny Novgorod, for example, where it's possible, at least in theory, to build missile boats. In fact, I know Russian missile boats have been built in Nizhny Novgorod, which is on the Volga. I'm not saying that any of the missile boats that have participated in the war have been built there, but perhaps they have. I mean, I don't know. But anyway, the Russians can reinforce their navy in the Black Sea by deploying these small missile boats which carry this enormous punch with the ability to launch Calibre missiles. They can deploy them across this enormous network of rivers and canals built, well, the rivers obviously are natural features, the canals largely the work of the Soviet Union, many of them, by the way, created during the rule of Joseph Stalin. The Russians can reinforce their fleet in the Black Sea. The Western powers can't get any ships there, and of course Ukraine can't obtain reinforcements through the Dardanelles, and its ability to construct ships on its own territory is massively restricted by Russian missile strikes. So Erdogan's move back in February 2022, though, according to Erdogan, an act of neutrality, one fully in line with the Montreux Convention, which regulates the way in which the Dardanelles operates, and, undoubtedly that is true. But anyway, Erdogan's decision to take this step in line with the Montreux Convention has in effect handed Russia control of the Black Sea. Turkey, of course, also has a navy in the Black Sea, a significant navy, and of course Turkish warships can move through the Dardanelles unimpeded, but that Turkish navy is not challenging or threatening or interfering with the military activities of the Russian Navy, the Black Sea Fleet in the Black Sea. So overall, despite Erdogan's declarations of neutrality, despite the fact that he has provided Ukraine with some weapons, Bayraktar drones, armoured personnel carriers, such things, overall, it seems to me that it's clear that he's tilted more to the Russians than to the Ukrainians in this conflict. And the reason he has won this election, surely, is because most people in Turkey wanted to stay that way. Now, this is something that perhaps people in the West find difficult to understand. I accept that within Turkey there is considerable support for Erdogan's religious and cultural policies, but even that doesn't alter the fundamental point that I'm just making, because of course those same religious and cultural policies are seen by many people in the West as antagonistic to the West, and they would like to see those policies changed. Now, Erdogan's opponent, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, again, apologies if I'm mispronouncing his name, he committed himself to continuing some of Erdogan's policies. He said that he wasn't going to change policy towards Russia, but he also gave a clear indication that he was seeking to improve relations with the West. He wanted to reactivate Turkey's long-standing application for membership of the European Union, which, by the way, would require Turkey, if it were ever to join the European Union, to impose sanctions on Russia. I think that many people in Turkey were skeptical of Kılıçdaroğlu's attempts to maintain distance from his Western backers, about which I will speak in a moment, and that was one of the key reasons why they voted against him. They were afraid that he would change Turkey's evolving geopolitical realignment, that he would move Turkey back away from its new friends in the Eurasian world, that he would tilt it back towards the West. They were afraid, perhaps, that he would prove sympathetic to Western demands to change some of the cultural and religious policies that Erdogan has implemented. And as I said, that's, in a sense, a part of the same thing. And coming to the fact that Kılıçdaroğlu did have backing in the West, I think they were very alarmed by the coverage of the election that appeared in the Western media, especially, I have to say, The Economist, which actually had a cover with the words "Erdogan must go," published before the first round, with lots of comments and commentaries in the West, predicting with little unconcealed glee that Erdogan looked likely to lose the election and to be defeated, to be pushed into second place in the first round. And I think that strengthened suspicions about Kılıçdaroğlu's long-term policies and shifted opinion back towards Erdogan. So that's, I think, why Erdogan in the end won. And it's an important fact, and it tells us a number of things about the future direction of Turkey, because though the election was closely fought, the fact that Erdogan won this election, obviously in part because of his charisma, the force of his personality, the successful parts of his record, but the reason that he won the election, ultimately for the reasons that he did, suggest that this realignment of Turkey away from the West towards perhaps its more obvious and natural geopolitical partners in the Eurasian world, China, Russia, Central Asia, Iran, and the rest, well, I think that tells us that this shift is now permanent, that it's not going to be reversed, that if a pro-Western leader ever does return to power, come to power in Turkey, and tries to shift this direction, he will be swimming against the tide, and the likelihood is that he won't succeed. Now, I should say that I've had an extremely helpful email from a Turkish person in Ankara. I'm not going to say more about him. I don't disclose details of people who write to me private emails, but he's provided a great deal of information about this election, and much, though not all, I want to make that clear, of what I've just said is based on some of the things that he said, but he's also made two particularly interesting points. The first is that Erdogan is indeed looking old and tired. There's also been concerns about corruption in his party, which, by the way, is well known in Turkey, I believe, and would have been another reason why he would normally have been expected to lose the election. But anyway, there are concerns about the long-term future of Erdogan, and I believe that there is a constitutional limit, which in theory at least prevents him from standing as president again, though of course constitutions can be changed. So it's likely that before long, Turkey, despite Erdogan's election, will have to confront the prospect of a Turkey without Erdogan. He will have to step down, or anyway, he won't be president of Turkey for the indefinite future. And this person has also made the point that there is no one in his party, in Erdogan's party, who looks remotely able to take his place, to maintain his policies, which are policies, as I said, which a critical mass of people in Turkey not only support, but are invested in seeing continue. So that might conceivably create a political space for someone. And this person has directed me to Sinan Oğan, and I believe this is now the correct pronunciation of his name. The G in the name isn't apparently stressed. So Sinan Oğan, and it turns out that Mr. Oğan has an interesting background, though he is clearly Turkish. His parents came from Azerbaijan, and he was born in Turkey as a Turkish politician. It seems he actually has connections in Azerbaijan. He studied there, partly studied there, and there are rumors, reports that he is on friendly terms with Azerbaijan's president, Ilham Aliyev. Quite possibly. There's something else about Oğan that's even more intriguing, which is that apparently he has a doctorate, and it's a doctorate in political science, and he obtained it at the Moscow School of International Relations, IMEMO, that famous institution, in some ways, if you like, the Russian equivalent of entities in the West like Sciences Po in Paris and the LSE in London, the place where many of the people who go into the Russian foreign ministry get their initial training. One of the most prestigious institutes of higher education in Russia, set up by the former Soviet foreign minister Vyacheslav Molotov all the way back in the 1940s. And it seems that Oğan did a postgraduate PhD course there, and obtained a PhD from there, has published books in Russia, and as well as English, speaks fluent Russian. And IMEMO, this institution where he was educated, is also a place, by the way, where he would have probably quite possibly, quite plausibly, established connections with many very senior people in the Russian political system and in the Russian elite. And this person who has sent me this email pointed out that it is most unusual in Turkey for somebody who has come literally from nowhere, politically speaking. I mean, he's been around in politics, but not in a particularly prominent way. Anyway, it's almost unheard of for someone like Erdogan to come effectively from nowhere and to win more than 5% of the vote in the first round of a presidential election. And that might suggest that this person has a significant political future ahead of him. And then when Erdogan does eventually depart the scene, this person could conceivably be a person to watch. He might build his support. He's got all the right connections. He's got all the right ideas. He appeals to many people in Turkey. He's perhaps the person for the future, the person who will seal this realignment, geopolitical realignment of Turkey, though that, of course, remains to be seen. Anyway, just to finish this discussion of the Turkish election and return shortly to Ukrainian things, can I say that Erdogan, I suspect, after this election, he said that he's going to continue his foreign policies, but my own feeling is that he'll probably want to tilt even more closely to the Russians and the Chinese. Why wouldn't he, given that this is the policy that has largely won him the election and which is perhaps the ultimate route towards stabilizing the Turkish economy? I suspect we're going to have him phoning Putin before very long. I gather Putin has already sent him a letter of congratulations. Erdogan is already again reiterating his plan to turn Turkey into a gas hub, and I'm sure that will happen. I'm sure this is now his further objective. I discussed recently how the unsuccessful Ukrainian attack on the Russian reconnaissance ship, the Ivan Hurs, near the Bosphorus, at a time when the Ivan Hurs was monitoring and conducting protective surveillance of the Turk Stream pipeline, is not going to go down well with Erdogan at all. So I suspect that Erdogan will want to forge ahead with his economic links with the Russians. There's talk, I believe, of building yet another nuclear power station. The Russians are very good at building nuclear power stations. There could be all kinds of joint ventures and all sorts of other things. Turkey wants to build its own fifth-generation fighter jet. The Russians have a fifth-generation fighter jet. They might work with Turkey, with an Erdogan-led Turkey, in order to do that. Who's to say? And the priority, I would have thought, after Erdogan has spoken to Putin, is setting up this meeting with Bashar al-Assad of Syria to finally bring about the end of Turkey's involvement in the Syrian war. And the talk now is that Erdogan wants a three-party meeting with Putin, Assad, and himself, and that will no doubt pave the way for the withdrawal of Turkish troops from northern Syria, and equally important for Erdogan, arrangements for the return to Syria of all the Syrian refugees who are now in Turkey. Erdogan will want to mend fences with another country with which he has in the past quarrelled, which is Saudi Arabia. I again expect before long that we will be seeing a reconciliation summit between Erdogan and MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. So lots going on, a big event. Some people, rather ridiculously, in the West are talking about Erdogan's victory as a win for Putin. Putin did not engineer Erdogan's victory in this election, but I suspect he's pleased by the outcome, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if there are some people in Moscow who, especially with an eye to the situation in the Black Sea, are breathing a sigh of relief. Anyway, that's what I get to say about the Turkish election. Let me now return to that perennial topic of these programs, which is the war in Ukraine. And over the last 24 hours, and still ongoing as I am making this program, is the single biggest combined missile and drone attack on Ukraine that the Russians have launched to date. It is huge and it is massively all-encompassing. It is taking place all across Ukraine. Lots of positions and logistical bases have been under attack. The governor, or perhaps mayor, of Khmelnytsky, this town in central western Ukraine, the place where that ammunition dump was destroyed with that gigantic explosion about 10 days ago, where there's been rumors that depleted uranium shells were stocked, something that's never been confirmed, by the way. But anyway, the same place has been one of the places attacked, and it seems that the mayor of this place, or governor, or whatever he is, has admitted that the airbase there has suffered significant damage and that 5 aircraft have been destroyed. A very unusual and very interesting admission, and I suspect possibly made because I understand that a British television crew is in the area and it might be difficult to conceal from them the reality of what's happening in Khmelnytsky. So in the light of that, you have to admit it. So major attack on Khmelnytsky, major attack on many places right across Ukraine. The Ukrainians are admitting that the port of Odessa has suffered damage. Other facilities in Nikolaev, in all kinds of places, have also been damaged. And as I said, this has been right across Ukraine. The biggest, most complicated strike of all has been in Kiev. Now, yesterday, I think I was talking about a big missile strike. Turned out it wasn't 52 drones, it was 54 drones, according to Ukraine, uranium-2 drones, all operating in and around Kiev. Apparently, dozens more over the course of the night after I made my program. More again today, but also lots of cruise missiles, including apparently some very powerful missiles. Rumours that they include Kinjal missiles, perhaps Iskander missiles. Not that they're easy to distinguish from each other, but lots of things going on. Very difficult to say exactly what is going on, but undoubtedly explosions all across Kiev. And of course the usual claims and rumours and stories. Now, there's been claims that there's been big explosions in the same airfield where the Patriot missile system that the Russians attacked about a week ago is based. Perhaps the Russians are finishing off what's left of that Patriot missile system, or if you prefer to believe the Ukrainian and American accounts, perhaps this is another attack on that Patriot missile system, or perhaps it's an attack on something completely different, perhaps other air defense systems that Ukraine planted there. What I would say is that the Russians, when they carried out the first attack on this airbase, they said that they destroyed a radar system and 5 launchers. The US said that the repair had been fixed, so perhaps more launchers and another radar was sent to replace it. A Patriot battery, consists of apparently 8 launchers, so perhaps the Russians went after those 3 remaining launchers and whatever other radar system there is. Now there's photographs, there's pictures, again, of debris all over Kiev, including what looked like spent Patriot missiles. It's not clear when these pictures were taken. I understand that there's a row underway between the mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, and Zelensky's office about who released these photos. I haven't been able to follow the details of this. But this is, in any event, a huge attack. And it's been suggested to me that the fact that this attack is continuing in daylight after the night attacks suggests that the Russians are starting to think that the air defenses in Kiev, which are clearly the primary targets of these strikes, have now become depleted, and that this is now why the Russians are able to launch more strikes on Kiev in daylight time. Now, I can't confirm this. What I will say is that there have been some extraordinary scenes from Kiev. Apparently, people have been told to stay indoors. Many people have fled to the Kiev underground, the metro system, which, like all Soviet-era metro systems, by the way, built across the Soviet Union, were in part designed to act as bomb shelters. So they are relatively safe there. There hasn't been many reports, by the way, of civilians being killed, despite all these missiles and shells, debris falling across Kiev, some of which undoubtedly are surface-to-air missiles falling back to Earth after they miss their targets. There's an extraordinary picture, which, by the way, I'm not sure whether it's real or fake, but it appears to show some kind of a rocket flying up into the air, doing some kind of move, and then crashing into into a building of some kind, a civilian building. Again, this is such a bizarre film. I'm not sure how real it is. But anyway, I'm not going to give a summary of what has been achieved by this huge missile strike until it's over. I think it is impossible for me to summarize that strike until it's over and done with. And of course, it's important always to say that even when it is over and completed, I can only comment on the basis of what each side is saying. I have no independent means of corroborating who is telling the truth. But anyway, the one thing we can say is that this is a huge missile and drone strike on Kiev primarily, but right across Ukraine. And I think one thing we can say with absolute confidence now is that all those endless reports extending all the way back to, I think it was the second week of March, that's when I first remember seeing something like this, I think it was in the Daily Telegraph, about the Russians running out of cruise missiles or missiles altogether. Well, we see how completely wrong those claims are. I mean, we've had them repeated every couple of weeks. The Ukrainians tell us that the Russians are almost out of missiles, that the next couple of strikes will be the last ones. There was, as I said, that report back in March of last year in the Telegraph, I remember, was actually saying that one of the reasons why the Russians couldn't sustain this offensive was because Russian cruise missiles use Ukrainian engines sourced from the Motor Sich factory, and since they weren't able to get more engines from Ukraine, they would run out of missiles very quickly. Well, we see how utterly wrong those claims were. And I think that is something that will have an effect on thinking in the West as well, by the way, given some of the talk about supporting the West, Ukraine, for the long haul. The Ukrainians, for the record, are trying to explain this seemingly unending supply of Russian cruise missiles that strike their territory by saying that the Russians have indeed increased production of cruise missiles, and they're now admitting that the Russians are making around 100 cruise missiles a month. Well, that was my guesstimate some months ago. I now suspect it is substantially more than that. Otherwise, I can't see how the Russians would be able to sustain an offensive on this kind of scale. I would point out, however, that the Russians, as I have said in previous programs, have unofficially said that they launch far fewer missiles on Ukraine at any one time than the Ukrainians themselves say, and that the Ukrainians repeatedly claim to have shot down more missiles than the Russians have actually launched. So it could be that the Ukrainians are not only underestimating the number of missiles that the Russians are producing, but also are underestimating the number of missiles that the Russians are launching, even as they continue to overstate the number of missiles that they actually shoot down. Now, that, of course, brings me to Ukrainian claims, again, about the missiles that they say they're shooting down. Once more, they're making, I think, wildly improbable claims about shooting down the great majority of the missiles. I think almost all of the missiles that the Russians have launched. As I said, the facts, the realities on the ground point to a different outcome. They seem to be suggesting that, in fact, many facilities in Kiev and across Ukraine are being hit. And as I said, there's been confirmation from Ukrainian sources that the airfield at Khmelnytsky has been badly damaged, and that the port in Odessa has been damaged as well. About the damage in Kiev, we are less well informed. Now, before I finish this interesting topic of these Russian missile attacks, I just wanted to make two further points. The Ukrainians have claimed that the Russians have a stock of around 50 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. The Russians, by way of refuting that, have said that they have increased their stock, their production rates of Kinzhal missiles. I think it was by 8-fold. I might be overstating it, but I think that was what the Russians said. Now, the Ukrainians said that the Russians were producing 2 Kinzhal missiles a month. If I remembered this correctly, and if it was 2 missiles a month, such missiles a month before the war started, then the Russians are making 16 of these a month. Now, it could be that they're making more than that still. I don't know. But anyway, that's what the Russians have said. And by implication, they're saying that they have a lot more than 50 Kinzhal missiles. How many? I have no idea. And the Ukrainians, for their part, have also told us something about the Uranium-2 drone. This is this propeller-driven drone. The Russians obtained the plans from Iran. Initially, they were buying large numbers of these drones from Iran. I get the sense now that most of the drones that are being used in these attacks are being made in Russia. I find it difficult to believe that these rather large drones actually could be used in such numbers unless the Russians had by now establish their own production line. There is another reason to think that the Russians have established their own production line for these drones, and that is that the Ukrainians are telling us that these drones have become more sophisticated. Now, the original Uranium 2s were very simple drones. They operated on a pre-programmed course. The place which they were supposed to hit was, as I say, pre-programmed into the drone when it was launched, and it followed that course directly until it eventually struck it. The Ukrainians are now saying that the Russians have developed some kind of capability using satellites to control the movement of these drones whilst they're actually flying, and that they use satellite guidance, the equivalent of the GPS guidance that the United States uses on its precision-guided weapons, at the point of strike, so that these have become very precise weapons indeed. By the way, the Russians won't be using the American GPS system, obviously. They have their own equivalent, which is called GLONASS, their own equivalent to GPS, which is called GLONASS. If you drive in Russia and you use a sat-nav system in Russia for your car, you will find that it is more likely than not operating on the GLONASS system rather than the GPS system that satellite navigation systems in cars use in the West. Just saying. So clearly the Uranium 2 has evolved and developed and become more sophisticated, and that has consequences because the Ukrainians say that it can maneuver, it can avoid Ukrainian air defense systems, it can carry out complex flight paths, it can attack from multiple directions. It's become a much more sophisticated system than it was when it was first used way back in the autumn. And we have the other side, because Ukrainian drone warfare isn't going particularly well. Now, short time ago, there was a report, I don't remember where it was first published, but it was confirmed by the Royal United Services Institute that Ukraine is losing 10,000 drones a day, a month, 10,000 drones a month, mainly to Russian electronic warfare system, interference. That would be 300 drones a day. And we've now had, these are overwhelmingly surveillance drones, but we've now had confirmation from Business Insider that the entire Bayraktar drone fleet that Ukraine bought from Turkey has been almost completely destroyed. The Russians, from about July 2022, were able to figure out how to shoot it down and have basically driven it away from the front lines and have shot down the great majority of them. There's a few Bayraktars still operating with the Ukrainian Air Force, but they're now used for surveillance missions, and they're apparently kept far away from dangerous areas, which of course begs the question of what it's been used for at all. Now, the Bayraktar was the original wonder weapon that Ukraine acquired before the fighting started, and which was assumed by many people based on its successful use by the Azerbaijani armed forces in the conflict with Armenia, and also by the Turkish military in Syria. It was widely expected to give Ukraine a decisive edge in the fighting. And as many, including, I should say on this occasion myself, predicted, it has failed utterly when confronted by the kind of layered and highly structured and sophisticated air defense system that Russia has. So that is the Bayraktar drone, which isn't apparently succeeding. And the Russians have now actually commented about the Storm Shadow. We've actually had a comment about the Storm Shadow, and it's appeared in TASS, in the TASS news agency. And I'll just read the report. It's published today. Russian air defenses have become more effective in destroying Storm Shadow missiles. A spokesman for the Donetsk People's Republic's Defense and Security Forces told TASS on Monday. It's important to remember that the Donetsk People's Republic's Defense and Security Forces are now completely integrated in the Russian armed forces. The Donetsk People's Republic now, in terms of Russian law, being a component part of the Russian Federation. Of course, the West and Ukraine and most of the world doesn't agree, but in Russian legal terms, it's part of Russia. And as far as the Russians are concerned, the armed forces of the Donetsk People's Republic are part of the Russian armed forces, and the air defense system will have been fully integrated with the Russian air defense system. Anyway, this is what the official is quoted by TASS as having said. The air defense systems are increasingly successful in countering the British missiles every day. Notice the word every day. The number of Storm Shadows destroyed in the sky grows. Now, of course, we have no independent corroboration of this either. Britain, Ukraine are not telling us how many Storm Shadows Russia has indeed shot down, but it does seem as if the Russians believe that they are shooting increasing numbers of them down. And for the record, I am confident that they are right. I was never someone who thought that the Storm Shadow really was the game-changing system that some people imagined. The Russian air defense system has rapidly got to grips with it and is proving increasingly successful in countering it. And given that the Storm Shadow was seen by many people as the substitute for the ATACMS missile that the United States refused in the end to supply to Ukraine, and was also apparently considered indispensable, or at least useful, in assisting Ukraine in launching its much talked about offensive. Well, the fact that the Russians are apparently successfully shooting it down must make many people in Ukraine concerned and wonder about the prospects for that offensive. And whilst I'm on the topic of this offensive, there's been some words about it from General Syrskyi. Now, General Syrskyi is the commander of Ukraine's ground forces. He was the person who had been given the task of defending Bakhmut for as long as possible. He appears to have assured Zelensky and the civilian officials in Kiev that Bakhmut could indeed be defended. One of the reasons why Zelensky, very unwisely, when he went to Congress in the United States back in December, waved a flag signed by the Bakhmut defenders and spoke about Bakhmut being the battle that would change the tide of the war. Well, Syrskyi is still there. It's not at all clear where he is, but he's now made this statement, and he says, as the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, that he's had a meeting with commanders of units and subunits that perform tasks in different sectors of the front. And he said, we jointly discussed possible scenarios for the development of events in this direction and the current situation at the front. Syrski noted that the time will soon come when we will move on to active offensive operations and defined specific tasks for preparing for them. Now, I find that a very interesting comment, because if one reads it carefully and takes it literally, which, by the way, perhaps one shouldn't, that suggests that planning for this offensive has not yet been finished. That Ukrainian commanders are still in the process of discussing, I'm quoting from the Ukrainian dispatch, discussing possible scenarios for the development of possible events, and that they've been given specific tasks preparing for them. That suggests that this offensive might not start this week, as some people expected, though perhaps one shouldn't place an excessive reliance upon this. Anyway, just saying, other Ukrainian officials like Mikhail Podolyak have previously said that the offensive is already underway. Well, it looks like Syrski, at least, doesn't think so. There's something else rather interesting about this particular encounter with the commanders of units and subunits that perform tasks in different sectors of the front, which Syrski has just held, which is, of course, that it is Syrski who seems to have chaired this meeting rather than Zaluzhny. Now, I've had lots of people just comment to me or send me comments about that very strange video of General Zaluzhny, which appeared the other day, which he sort of sits behind a desk. Is questioned. There's a reference to the date. All I would say about it is this. I still think, based on what I've seen in this video, that it doesn't seem to me as if Zaluzhny was in fact wounded or severely injured in some kind of Russian shelling or missile or bomb attack. I've noted very carefully what people have said about this. I want to thank everybody, by the way, who's written to me on this topic. But to me, with my, shall we say, less than perfect vision, and of course my complete ignorance of medical matters, it still looks to me as if he doesn't look like someone who suffered kind of severe head and trauma that some people have been saying. But it does nonetheless look like Zaluzhny is very disengaged. I mean, he has this rather odd encounter with this Ukrainian journalist. They have an exchange a few words. The whole thing looks very eerie and very eerily set up. And as I said in the program where I discussed it, it does beg lots of questions. What is he up to? Why is this person who was once so visible in the war, why is he acting in this strange way? Now, I've discussed both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, with my colleague Alex Christoforou, possible scenarios. But it does seem to me that one possible and perhaps increasingly plausible scenario is that he is out of favour, that there's been long-standing reports that he and President Zelensky often don't see eye to eye on operational matters, that Zaluzhny wanted, for example, the withdrawal from Bakhmut, which President Zelensky categorically opposed, that he was more skeptical about the offensives in Kharkiv and in Kherson region last year, which did regain a lot of ground, but at the price of enormous losses. And I do wonder whether perhaps what's happened, especially in light of this conference that, as I said, Syrskyi has chaired, which I would have thought Zelensky would at least want to be engaged in. I'm wondering whether perhaps what's happened is that Zelensky can't quite dismiss Zelensky because of this totemic quality that Zelensky has acquired, that he's hugely respected across much of Ukrainian society. He's been spoken up, talked up in the West. So Zelensky has been quietly told, or perhaps not so quietly told, that he needs to take a rest and step aside. And whether Syrskyi, who by contrast seems more willing to implement Zelensky's orders, including wrong orders like the defense of Bakhmut, whether after lying low himself for some time, perhaps to allow Zelensky space to shunt Zelensky aside, whether it isn't Syrskyi now who is in overall charge of the conduct of the war. Now, I want to emphasize again, this is pure guesswork. I don't know, and I don't have answers to this, but the Zelensky affair is now getting stranger by the day, and one would like to see an explanation, and it doesn't seem as if we're ever going to have one. Well, I discussed lots of things. I haven't discussed up to this point what I usually begin my programs with, which is what's actually happening on the battlefronts. And again, it's the case that there hasn't been a huge amount of news. But overall, the picture one gets is the same picture that I was discussing in my program yesterday, of steady incremental Russian pressure all along the front line. And it seems that the Russians not only have held on to that bridgehead they've acquired across the Oskol River, but that they're steadily and methodically enlarging it. And that does beg the question whether they have some plan to perhaps launch some significant counterattack in that area. And it's interesting, by the way, that one of the big targets for one of the recent Russian missile strikes was the town of ETHEREUM, which the Russians abandoned back in the autumn, and which obviously lies west of the Oskol River. Whether perhaps the Russians aren't thinking of pushing back in that direction, who's to say? Maybe they are, maybe they're not, maybe they want the Ukrainians to think they are. We can never know. And in addition, it seems that the Russians are also steadily increasing pressure on Ivanivska in particular. They do seem to be preparing the ground for a big attack on Chasiv Yar. And some comments that Prigozhin has made, even as the Wagner forces pull out of Artyomovsk, as I will now call it, the former Bakhmut, and get replaced by regular army troops and allegedly by Chechen forces, though I haven't seen pictures of them in Artyomovsk at the moment, but there's been multiple reports that they are entering Artyomovsk and being deployed to the area. And there's no doubt that Russian airborne troops, drawn apparently from the 106th Airborne Guards Division, are now active taking the battle to the Ukrainians in Ivanivska. Anyway, it could very well be that the Russians do indeed intend to push hard towards Ivanivska and ultimately to Chasov Yar once the redeployments in this area have been completed. Prigozhin certainly seems to hint at this, though, as I've said many times, he's not perhaps the most reliable of commentators. Anyway, in the meantime, we also have more reports, that the Russians are intensifying the pressure on Avdiivka, and that Russian aircraft operating glide bombs, these big 500-kilo glide bombs, are being particularly busy in the Avdiivka front, and I wonder whether that will be the next big town to fall. Anyway, we will see. Let me repeat again that in terms of the ground war, all the indications for the moment are that the Russians are continuing with the strategy that they hit upon last summer and after the Ukrainian counteroffensives of the autumn reverted to over the late autumn and winter and spring, which is to make haste slowly, to steadily increase their forces, make themselves more powerful, establish themselves as an irresistible force, and in Surovikin's words, grind the Ukrainians down. They ground them down in Bakhmut, they're grinding them down in other places, in Marinka, in Avdiivka, in other places, and they're grinding down Ukraine's air defense system with these extended missile strikes, and also with the operations that they are launching against Kiev in particular, but also against the various base and logistical facilities of the Ukrainian army. And it could be that it's these missile strikes and these Ukrainian losses that are in part, or in large part, the explanation for the repeated delays in which Ukraine is showing in conducting this offensive. Now, I want to, before I finish this video, discuss a program that, rather an article which I've commented upon previously by Ray McGovern. He asked rhetorically in that article the same question that I've asked various interlocutors myself, which is that one is constantly up against this comment about Putin and Russia, the fact that the Russians launched this war in February 2022. Many people who accept that the Russians were severely provoked nonetheless say that it was a mistake for the Russians to do that, and that the Russians should have explored other options, done other things. And Ray McGovern has asked the question, well, if that's what people think, they should tell us what those alternatives were. And I myself, as I've said, have had conversations about this with people. I've asked several times, what were these alternatives? And people haven't really been able to give me a satisfactory explanation of what were those alternatives. Now, my asking that question, piggybacking on Ray McGovern's article, has predictably produced a flood of comments, emails, some of which have been extremely helpful, and I want to say. I'm going to say straight away, though, that again, I've seen some people suggest, alternatives, none of them, as far as I can see, really fulfill, really respond to the Russian concerns of the time. There's been one suggestion which I have read, is that somebody said that if Ukraine had launched this attack on Donbass in February 2022, which the Russians are saying that Ukraine was going to launch, well, the Russians could have engaged in a major international and media campaign about that. I don't see what difference that would have made. I don't see that solved any of the problems that the Russians were addressing or concerned about. And I don't see that that kind of campaign would anyway have resolved the underlying problem, which was the relentless expansion of NATO, contrary to undertakings given by Western officials to first the Soviet leadership and then the Russian leadership at the end of the beginning of the 1990s, and the way in which officials in the West continued, like, for example, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, continued to speak about Ukraine one day joining NATO and the United States refusing to negotiate or discuss or agree with the Russians about a possible agreement that Ukraine would never join NATO and would remain neutral. So I've never seen anybody address this question or provide an answer to this. Anyway, Ray McGovern has been involved in a discussion with John Mearsheimer. Now, John Mearsheimer, who is Professor Mearsheimer, as I should call him, is perhaps the arch exponent of the realist school in the United States, certainly US academia. He's a man for whom I have huge respect. I should say I don't always agree with his perspective on many things, but then we're not all obliged to agree with each other on all things. And certainly Professor Mearsheimer is someone to take extremely seriously. And Professor Mearsheimer has given an address, and you can find it all, the video is there, in which he has again essentially confirmed that Ukraine is going to lose this war. He said that Ukraine is not going to regain control of the 4 regions that the Russians annexed in the autumn. Presumably, the Russians will regain control of that part of the 4 regions, or will gain control of that part of the 4 regions, which they don't already control. Professor Mearsheimer seems to think that it's likely that before this is over, that the Russians will control even more Ukrainian territory beyond the 4 regions. Well, we will see. But anyway, the most interesting exchange, as far as I can see, was the one between Ray McGovern and John Mearsheimer. And Ray McGovern has written about this, and you'll find the article, the link, under this program. Anyway, Ray asked Professor Mearsheimer, in your opinion, what options, what alternatives did Russia have which it could have pursued instead of the military campaign that Putin ordered in February 2022. And I don't think I'm misrepresenting Professor Mearsheimer's answer by saying that Professor Mearsheimer basically said that the Russians had no alternative options. That was the only thing in the circumstances that they could do, given the way in which the United States and the Western powers were ignoring their red lines and were disregarding their security interests. Now, I have to say, if that's indeed Professor Mearsheimer's view, and you can read Ray McGovern's article, I think it's clearly what Professor Mearsheimer thinks. If he wants to walk that back at some point, that's, of course, for him to do, or perhaps he can say that his words have been misunderstood, but to me they look clear enough. If that's what Professor Mearsheimer thinks, if that's what Ray McGovern thinks, and I don't want to read thoughts into Ray McGovern's mind, he's not, I think, answered his own question. But if that is what these two very eminent people think, Professor Mearsheimer, as I said, the leading academic, the leading voice in the United States of the realist school of thinking in international relations. Ray McGovern, the CIA's premier analyst on Soviet and Chinese affairs, a man who used to prepare the daily brief for the President of the United States. If these eminent people think that there was no alternative, who am I to disagree? I have not been able to think of an alternative myself. And I suspect that the reason I have not been able to is because, as Professor Mearsheimer seems to say, and as Ray McGovern suggests, there wasn't one. Anyway, that I intend to end this program today. Lots more to discuss. I'm going to return in my next program to the diplomacy, which is becoming really very interesting and very complicated. But as I said, this is where I finish this program today. Thank you for joining me again today. Just to remind you once more, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Please also remember to go to our shop. You can buy all our great things there, our hats, our hoodies, our magic mugs, our rucksacks, our bottles, all these amazing things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and all that remains is for me to wish you a very good day.